Hello, everyone. We'll just give in 1 or 2 minutes to let everyone join, and we'll be starting soon. But yeah, feel free to add and introduce yourself in the comments in the meantime. Oh, it looks like the chat is disabled. Yeah, we're looking into that. So just give us a second. But thank you for flagging that.
Okay, it should be enabled now. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. We'll just kind of play a quick video as an intro, just as a heads up that the sound might be a bit loud. But yeah, it should be, hopefully it isn't, and we'll get started.
Merci beaucoup.
Hello, friends and esteemed colleagues. Welcome. My name's Keir Powell-Lewis. I'm Head of Environmental Sustainability at the British Film Institute. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to know who you are and where you are from. For those who appreciate audio description, I'm a white male with brown hair, glasses, and a Britney Spears style headset on this afternoon. You're very welcome at this Sustainable Screen Programme webinar run by our friends at Julie's Bicycle. This is the second of 3 webinars we will run this year for BFI National Lottery awardees and all members of industry for whom this is relevant. Please do share this webinar with your friends and colleagues afterwards. We will be making it available on the Julie's Bicycle website, and we will circulate it around to attendees once it's published so that you're able to refer back to this. We're pleased to see awardees, friends, colleagues, industry members from across the UK. And it's really important to us that we're able to reach as many people as possible with this information that we're making available today. Julie's Bicycle are one of 2 partners on the BFI Sustainable Screen Programme, alongside BAFTA Albert. Julie's Bicycle are responsible for all of our sector support beyond production. So cinemas, festivals, screen archives, skills development, other sector support. And they will be providing a range of resources over the next 3 years, 2.5 years now, that will be freely available to industry. So do sign up to their mailing list so that you can keep up to date with what information you've got. You can also sign up to the BFI Press and Industry newsletter, where we will be sharing those resources. Today's session is about making some commitments and thinking about how sustainability works for you in your organization, in your funded activity, and what might be really meaningful and practical for you. The BFI takes an impact-based approach to sustainability. We care about what's meaningful and achievable, but also ambitious with the resources that we have available. As a bit of wider context, in my role, I'm also working beyond this national lottery portfolio, looking at initiatives where we can support production and beyond production to be more sustainable in a step change from what we've done in the past. So if you are interested and you'd like to talk to me about other initiatives beyond the support that Julie's Bicycle and BAFTA Albert offer, then please do get in touch. My contact details will be in the chat shortly. Other than that, I'm going to hand over to the Julie's Bicycle team to take us through it, and I will be back for the question and answer session at the end. So enjoy.
Thank you, Kier, and hello, everyone. I'm Ami Hanko. I'm a sustainability specialist at Julie's Bicycle, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black mixed-race woman, and I'm wearing a black jumper, sadly missing the Britney Spears-styled microphone. But yeah, maybe if you attended our last webinar, you know me from there. Today, I'm also here with my colleagues, Richard, who I will for him to introduce himself later, and also Lucas, who is helping on the back end. So any tech questions, please do direct them to Lucas. And in terms of today's webinar session, which is going to be about an hour, as Kier mentioned, we're going to be looking at developing our environmental priorities and plans. So we'll start by quickly, having a look into why is this important that we make those commitments. And then we'll walk you through some steps when it comes to developing your own environmental policies and your own environmental action plans that we hope will be useful. And hopefully we'll have time at the end as well for some Q&A. And just some general housekeeping. So we mentioned this already in the chat, but there's a function to activate the auto captioning function in case that you need that. It should appear on the bar, in the lower bar in your screens. But feel free to also use the chat and Q&A function. So as you've been doing already, it's been lovely to read some of the comments and see who is here today. Do introduce yourselves in the chat, and feel free to share any comments, ideas, or any good experiences that you want to share with the rest. And if you have any questions throughout the sessions, then you can put them in the Q&A chat function, and hopefully we'll do our best to also answer them as we go. As Kier mentioned, we're recording the session and we'll make this available after the webinar as well, including the slides. And once the session is finished, it should appear in your screens just a brief questionnaire, like a survey. So we kindly ask if you can complete that, as we will appreciate any feedback that you can give us. So, well, Kier has already kind of mentioned our role in supporting the beyond production strand with the BFI Sustainable Screen Program, so I'm not going to repeat myself on that. But yeah, just to reinforce that you're more than welcome to visit our website if you want to know a bit more about the support that we're offering, as well as joining our mailing list. And just to mention as well that today's session is part of a series of webinars that we started back in September. Maybe you attended the last one. So if you didn't have the chance to attend it, you can find also the recording available in our website. We will also leave the link here. So the first one, we kind of looked into the causes and consequences of the climate, nature, and justice crisis, a bit of an overview of what climate justice means, and then what the screen sector can do to affect meaningful positive change. Today's session is all about developing environmental priorities and plans, and it's going to be complemented with a third session that we're going to do in January, the Getting to Grips with Environmental Performance and Progress. for which we will be launching the registrations, and more information is going to be available soon. But I'll pass on to Richard so we can get started with the session and looking into why this is important.
Thank you, Amy, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Richard Phillips, and I work as a climate change specialist at Julie's Bicycle. As an audio description, I wear glasses, I have short blonde hair, and a dark jacket, and there's not much interesting behind me whatsoever, just a white room. Just first of all, I'd like to start with an icebreaker. It's maybe slightly unconventional for a webinar, but just to get you all using the chat, I'd like to put into the chat there what words come to mind when you think of climate change. It can be anything. Just fire away and put some descriptive words into the chat for words you think of climate change. This is always an interesting one to start with, because I guess it kind of gets out a lot of the frustration and the fear straight away. So doom, imminent, stress, hope, that's a good one. Guilt, data, that's an interesting one. Hopelessness. So often, a lot of kind of worrying sentiments. Transformation, that's a great one. Anna Island. And then if we move to the next slide, Annie, if you could then put in the chat, this is very unconventional, words that come to mind when you think of environmental policies and action plans. It can be anything. Not enough, inadequate. It's interesting. Confusing. Well, hopefully we'll clarify that in the session. Ineffective, lack of clarity. Challenging. Interesting. It's a really interesting combination there. I think there's definitely some main themes that are coming out of that already, just in that short exercise. I think what's interesting in terms of environmental plans and policies, action plans, what we're talking about today, is that really this is how we break down problems as humans, really, as people. The climate crisis and environmental crises that we face are obviously so huge, and it can feel very overwhelming. I think that word came up a few times within that little exercise, like the word overwhelming. But the way of doing action plans correctly, and as some of you pointed out, often they might not be seen as enough, or they're working too slowly. But if you do it right, which hopefully we'll get to through this webinar, it's something that we can then do something about the scale of the problem that we face. As humans, we like to make plans, and that is the way that we tackle problems. So if you do that in an effective way, which hopefully we'll go through in this webinar, then we'll be on the road to doing something about the scale of the problem that we face. Next slide, please, Annie. So why is it important to make these environmental policies and action plans? Well, first of all, really, it's to meet expectations. It's to meet these growing expectations of environmental action. The wider environmental context was covered in the first webinar, so I won't repeat that too much here, and I encourage you all to revisit that webinar if you need to. But the summary is really, as we all know, the environmental situation is severe and there is pressing need for action. But there are other pressures on organisations to make these policies and action plans. And I think these can be looked at in a global sense, in a sectoral sense, and an organisational one as well. So starting with the global, COP28 is currently live, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. This is the largest political gathering around climate. And obviously those discussions are ongoing, and they're very complex, and they haven't really met the need and demands of what we need to face the crisis currently. But we are unmistakably on a path towards net zero, and that is the trajectory that we need to get to. And it requires all of society to make plans to achieve that. It's not the responsibility of any one country, any one sector. Of course, there are big players, but all of society needs to move to net zero emissions. So that is the kind of the first pressure looking from a global perspective. But of course, it's not just about climate change and reducing emissions. There's obviously the related impacts of nature and biodiversity too. And these are the things that we need to consider at a global scale. And this is why I'm talking about kind of breaking it down into environmental policies and action plans. There's also this challenge of the sector as the whole. So every industry, as I say, is responding to the need for action, and the film and screen sector is no different. So there's plenty that's going on, and just two examples here is the Creative Industries Charter, which is industry leaders in the cultural sector and the UK government coming together to outline how the creative sector can use its collective imagination and economic influence to reduce its environmental impacts. And what that has done is set targets for the sector, along with commitments for collaboration and advocacy. So it's just an example, really, of how we're moving towards this goal of sustainability. There's also equity for a new Green Deal. Equity being the Performing Arts and Entertainment Trade Union, made up of 47,000 performers and creative practitioners. And the New Green Deal is a network of equity members fighting for climate justice in the industry and beyond the industry as well. And it has a manifesto, which is focused on buildings and operations, pension funds, and sponsorship, among other things as well. So there's pressure from kind of the global lens, and there's pressure sectorally to implement environmental action plans and policies. And then crucially, the third thing here is that there's growing expectations from the people that matter most to your organization, so employees and consumers. The Indigo Act Green Report 2023 found that 87% of cultural audiences are worried about the climate crisis, and 93% have made changes to their lifestyle to help tackle it. So audiences are demanding more, as are employees. There are other findings that over 70% of employees want to work for sustainable companies. That was from IBM. So all the indication is pointing towards the need for organizations to demonstrate their environmental actions through policies, but crucially also through action plans as well. Next slide, please. And this is also about managing your organization for the future. So in a very practical sort of way, policies and action plans are about good management of an organization, not just about environmental impacts. So as with any other part of your organization, you need to set objectives and have accountability. And doing so for the environment and for environmental impacts, in some ways, is no different to any other function that you have within your organization for setting long-term plans. So I just want to do a quick poll, if Lucas, you can bring that up, and as we move to the next slide, which is just to ask how many of you have targets in place currently. So how many of you have environmental commitments and goals already in place? This is just to get a sense of where you're at on this journey. Some of you might be brand new to it. Some of you may have developed them in the past 6 months to a year, or some of you may have longer term plans already in place. So hopefully that's given enough time to respond. Okay, so a bit of a split, but the majority of you are already having those environmental commitments and goals in place. Obviously, it was just kind of a simple yes and no. So some of those goals might be extensive across your environmental impacts. Some of them may be just to have a net zero target, more or less the kind of starting point. But there's also a large proportion of you which who might just be considering this. In this case, this webinar will be very useful for building those policies. I think just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next poll and hand back to Amy, who's going to talk through environmental policies.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for responding. So yeah, hopefully today's session will be useful for both if you're just starting to define and think about your commitments, and also if you already have those in place, as we've seen a majority of you do. But yeah, I was just reading through the chats and seeing some of those associated words when it comes to policy, as in not enough or inadequate or empty of words and all of this, which sadly in some cases it can be the case, because it feels like as more of us kind of put out these commitments and policies, that kind of creates a bit of pressure and maybe leads to people just kind of coming up with something just to have it, and then it results in something that is not really relevant to who you are and what you want to do. So all in all, what we want to reinforce throughout today is when it comes to defining your commitments, this has to be based on who you are, where you are, what do you do, and who you do it with. And most importantly, what it is that you value and what you want to see change. And these are all things that are for you to determine and come up and uncover through your environmental commitments and targets as well. So it is all a process. We will see that it is all a iterative process as well. But it's definitely something that all organizations will really go through if they want to make meaningful commitments when it comes to the environment and sustainability. And it's a good practice to formalize all of these commitments into environmental policy, as some of you may have that in place or not. But just as a definition, an environmental policy, what it is a public statement of your organizational values, principles, and commitment to positive environmental change. There's different reasons as to why you'd want to have an environmental policy. Some of them were already mentioned. But most importantly, what it provides is that unified direction and purpose that is going to guide your actions, because in a way it's kind of standardizing what is good practice and what good practice means to you and your organization. And it will, in that sense, support also your decision making as you go along. And at the same time, it also provides effective engagement with your different stakeholders, being your staff, being your suppliers, being your audiences, or kind of the wider community, because in the end, what your policy is saying is what your organization believes and is committing to. So it's your guiding compass for yourself, but it's also telling, your external stakeholders what it is that you are valuing and prioritizing. And making it very specific is something that I'm going to be repeating throughout the session. That is definitely one of the key elements for policies to be really meaningful and successful. So make it specific to the nature of your activities and impact, so it's relevant to what it is that you do. What we also see is that most successful policies are those that are supported and signed by a director or top management or a board. This is not only to kind of showcase there's a buy-in from the top, but there is also an accountability behind those commitments, so that it doesn't really become those empty words that someone was sharing in the chat. And the third one is that policies are all about people, and there are for people. So any successful, meaningful policy are gonna be developed based on the discussions, on the conversations, on the knowledge that you're gonna gather from your team, from the wider staff, from the wider community, and any other relevant stakeholders. So just through this bit, I'll walk you through the different steps that we identify in terms of developing your environmental policy, which are the 5 that you can see here on screen, but I'll go into each of these next. But as I said, this is all an iterative process. These steps may look differently to each of you. You may probably go back and forth through some of these steps as you kind of progressively build that clearer picture of what your policy says, but overall it's just kind of to give you a guide to aid you in this process. And well, the first step in any policy that we want to develop, what it needs is to have that good discussion of what we value and what you want to see change. And depending on the size of your organization, you may kind of need like a lot of workshops, or maybe that's just one meeting. You will have different ways to do that, but it's kind of having how are you going to collect those inputs that are going to help you uncover what you all value and want to see change, and how these may realistically happen, because definitely we want to talk about things that we want to change, but then something that we want to achieve. And that's not to say, we cannot be ambitious. We definitely, I encourage you to be ambitious and dream big and all of that. We definitely want to do that. But it's just in this exercise of putting together our policies and then our action plans, where we are defining clearly what it is that we want to achieve and how we want to do that in a very realistic matter. Because what we want is have a clear path, and ultimately the goal is just to understand what's the most immediate next steps in this path for us to do. But a good starting point is just to kind of understand, what does your organization stands for and who do you stand with? And then you can start to kind of scope those areas where you would like to see change. Um, it's also good practice in developing your policy to kind of reflect on how your work aligns with different commitments at the local, national, global commitments, and some of the ones that Richard was alluding to as well. Um, so you can start thinking, are there any of these maybe global particular issues that then are more affecting or more concerning to where you are, your community, that being, air pollution, is it a lack of green spaces, is it potential flooding, is it poverty, what are the issues that are mostly around you that maybe your work can be aligning to, and how maybe you can contribute to those goals and in which ways you could do that. Or if you're aligned with or connected to any social movements or organizations that are already working towards these objectives, how can you link the work that you do with them? So it's kind of opening it a bit wider than your kind of immediate day-to-day activities, just for you to understand um, and come up and uncover what it is important to you as an organization. But as I say, a good starting point is to kind of maybe as a team start to have those conversations and see what people bring. Um, but ultimately, with your policy, what you want is to distill and articulate your purpose and values to bring that alignment, direction, and meaning to what you stand for and how you work. And especially in understanding your why, as in why are we doing this? Why is this important to us? And having that as a reminder when challenges arise, because we know that any change is hard and there's going to be challenges and potential obstacles. So it's like, how do we keep that vision even when challenges comes up, and maybe, as things change, do we need to change our vision as well? So it's important that we revisit this as in our policy through time. But you all will have different reasons as to why. So yeah, maybe if you want to put in the chat, maybe what would be a good reason for you to have an environmental policy, and see what comes up as I continue. Then the second part or step would be, if you start to have a bit of an understanding, an idea of why is this important or what matters to you, and you sort of draft in that vision, then you have to understand, what is your starting point, where are you now? So this is about kind of mapping or evaluating your activities and practices. It's just, having very clearly identify what you do and where, perhaps depending on the nature of your activities, but who comes to your events or your screenings or your activities or your venues. What are the main types of travel and transport you use, not only by your audiences and who comes to your events, but also maybe your staff or yourself, like how are you getting to your venue or your office? And what are the type of goods, services, materials that you use? What is all of that you need or that is needed for you to run your activity? And when you have defined that, that is just to kind of set it out and understand what is out there. Then you can start to think, how do you want to see these things to look differently? Because maybe there are things that you don't need to wait to act. Like, is there something that you can change quickly and relatively easily, in terms of, influencing that behavior so it's more aligned with what it's important to you, what matters to you, to your values. So it's starting to kind of map, or do this exercise of understanding what you can already do now, and what are the things where you start to see that will require a bit more time, a bit more planning, a bit more effort, or potentially resources. So as I said, can you change, can you already change the way that you travel to your venue? Can you change when the equipment is on and off if it's not always used? Can you influence the behaviors of your audiences through the programming? Maybe is that something that is not as immediate, it will take a bit more time. Again, this will depend on the matter of your activity. Sometimes, or overall, this is to kind of understand what you can directly control and what you can influence, and this will depend on a range of factors. But as a way of doing this, it might be helpful to think in terms of your direct impact, so what falls within your direct control, And this may be related to your operations or your venue or all that I mentioned. That is kind of what you need to kind of run your activity. And then move on to thinking about those areas where you might have a bit more of an indirect impact or less control, but you can still influence through maybe the ways that you engage with your audience. To then move on to reflecting on the place that you occupy in the wider context and ecosystem, from your local community to the wider sector and beyond. So it's like structuring just that map of where you are and what spaces you occupy. And what you see now is in the screen is an example from Creative Scotland. So this is part of their climate emergency and sustainability plan, where they recognize their influence on climate change behavior through different ways. And specifically, they do, for them, it's through their operations, but then also through the funding that they provide to directly support organizations and projects, through the partnerships that they establish, and also through the advocacy and influence that they can have on the wider arts, screen and creative industries. So, and they have also kind of laid out that their aim is to grow and expand their influence over time, as visualized in this illustration. So they kind of focusing on what they can directly control now, and over time they'll kind of move into those wider spheres of influence. So something for you to think about if you haven't done that exercise yet. But then, once you have the understanding, okay, this is what it's important to me, this is what matters, this is what my activities are now, who is involved, what do I use and need for my activities to move, and what is more in my direct control or influence sphere. Then you can start think about gathering the relevant information and data that is going to help you further understand and evidence as well your impacts. At the same time, identify where there might be some of those information gaps. So to know where to start looking for that more tangible information and data, you can think about what impact areas are relevant to you and are likely to have a big environmental impact. So, for example, if you're an exhibitor, if you're a cinema, let's say, you probably know that, yeah, energy use is often a big impact area if you have a venue. So it would make sense for you to kind of collect and be aware of your energy use, and over time build that understanding around what influences and impacts your energy use, just to also kind of make sense of that data. Or if you are a cinema, or maybe also you hold events or have a festival, then you know that audience travel is often the biggest source of carbon impact. But then you may identify that, well, we don't really know, we don't have that information, we don't really know how to collect that data, but it's something that we know it's going to have a big impact, so we definitely should look into that. So it's for you to kind of reflect on these different things, but obviously it would all depend on the type of organization and nature of your activities. And it may be helpful to kind of look into, what's already available in terms of the screen sector, because there's already plenty in terms of the not only the commitments, but also, the different resources, because those will give you clues into the specific areas that might be relevant for your activities. And also just to mention that, as Julie's Bicycle and Kira said, we're putting different resources out there, and one of them is going to be in the new year. We're putting together like a website that is going to host, kind of signpost all the available resources that are there for the screen sector, and it's going to kind of outline what good does look like for different activities. So hopefully that should also be helpful for as you kind of map out your different priorities. And also, just to add on this point, also consider, the information that you can get through your relationships, as in your stakeholders. So especially in procurement, whether or not contractors and suppliers are addressing some of these issues that are relevant for you, and think about, where are your greatest areas of spend, and where are these products or services sourced from, and if they have any policies or certifications, and just to kind of continue map out that understanding that is all of this aligned with what matters to me, or is that an area for me to focus on that I can drive further action as well. And, you know, when it comes to data, we have to make sense of it. Otherwise, data on its own is really pointless, is not really selling us anything. And this is something that, you know, this point of building understanding using information that you gather comes really hand in hand with gathering that information that we just saw in step 3. And today we're just giving you an overview, but these are mainly the areas that we're going to be focusing a bit more into detail in the next webinar as to how to build that kind of data system. What are the different sources of data to consider, and what when there's gaps, what can we do to address them? So, you know, we'll go more into detail into that. But this is about, you know, when you understand that there's some gaps there, and what else is beyond your immediate, you know, control in terms of gathering the information, is developing that broader sense of possibilities and priorities. So it's definitely reaching out to your stakeholders and speak to them and understand, you know, what they think is most important, what they could or would do to support change, and identify any barriers to that change as well. So kind of using that with all the data you're collected, you'll use that information, use that evidence to start prioritizing those areas where you want to start putting effort and where you want to take action. And especially identifying with now a much more evidence base where you can make that difference. So that's where you want to kind of put your focus on. And then once you have that understanding, which I said at the beginning, these are steps that maybe you will go a bit back and forth as you develop more understanding over time, but at least it's going to start to give you a clearer picture of where you want to make that difference and what you want to prioritize, and ultimately what it is that you want to commit and especially make those commitments very tangible, very measurable, because we don't want this to be empty commitments that, you know, mean a very generic or mean nothing, or even try to cover too much, which sometimes that happens too. And it's important that underneath this process of commitment, there's also processes of, you know, how we're going to monitor and review our policy and any progress that we're doing, and also in terms of accountability. So do think about who has what responsibilities and who is ultimately accountable. Think about how you're monitoring and reviewing progress, and how and to whom you will communicate best as well, because this will be maybe differently in terms of when you communicate to your teams and your staff as to how you communicate it, like publicly through your website or your audiences. But ultimately, you know, putting all this together in this kind of guiding compass, you don't want to just stop there. What you want is now see, how am I bringing this to life? How am I putting this into action through my action plan, which is what Richard is going to talk us through in the next bit. But yeah, just to reinforce what I said at the beginning, that this is a process. So do not try to just, you know, change the world. Like, definitely that's the ultimate ambition we all want, but let's make tangible, identifiable, measurable steps, and understand that ambitions are gonna stretch over time as action leads to changes. And if anything, you are the best place to know your organization best. So as you go through these different processes and start gaining understanding, you will build that kind of wide understanding of your impacts and what you can do to kind of act meaningfully. I'll pass it to you, Richard.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ami. So Ami's just gone through there is the starting point, really, which is setting the environmental policy and getting that in place and what that entails. But that isn't necessarily putting it into action. So what is an environmental action plan? Well, that's about putting your policy into some steps which you can take to deliver against them. So an environmental action plan is a much more detailed and specific document about how you would deliver against the aims which are included within your environmental policy. There are some classic components of an environmental action plan which have been highlighted there in the table in quite a basic way, but it's kind of sets it out. That it will be led by the target, which will be from your environmental policies, really. And then what the actual action will be, which will be a number of bullet points of specific actions that you're going to take, specific interventions, the timeline that you'll deliver against, the lead or the person responsible, and the budget that you've got to put to that, if any. So as with your environmental policy, you need to develop this environmental action plan to fit with the nature and level of your organization and your organization's activities, also your organization's key impacts, and the level of progress on environmental sustainability that you've made so far. So these are the key components of the action plan. And over the next few slides, I'm just going to go into these in a little bit more detail with the time that we have left. So the first is targets. So this is the first column really, that sets then the agenda for the rest of the actions that you're going to take and who's going to deliver against them. So of course you need to define the key objectives and targets within the environmental policy that Amy outlined. I think these will be at much higher level, things like net zero, things like the kind of big targets that you want to reach. But within the action plan, we recommend using the SMARTY framework really for implementing those targets. So that's that they are the targets are strategic, measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound, and inclusive and equitable are probably the two that are added on to the typical SMART framework for setting targets. So this is to include the social impacts of what you're doing as well as the environmental ones. So just some examples on the screen there. So just very simply to reduce your energy use emissions by 50% by 2030, or to eliminate problem plastics, single-use plastics, for example, within 2 years. These are some just examples really of high-level quantitative targets that you can make that ladder up to the bigger objectives in your environmental policy. But just to note that they don't need to be numerical. They can also be qualitative. So for example, pilot a sustainable exhibition or event in the coming year. I think that's an important one because sometimes we can get very focused on the numbers, but there are other positive impacts that you can have, which we know have a positive impact, but might not be as easily measurable. On the next slide, we have an example of one of you who might be on the call, might not be, who has done this very well, which is Lewis Depot. So this is their action plan on the right, and it follows that very familiar format of having the targets, the action, the project lead, who I've actually redacted that, but it is publicly available, and the time frame as well to deliver against it. And what I think is really good about this example is that it's very detailed, it's very clear, it's got very clear set deadlines which ensure all of that accountability and ensure that you can review progress over set periods of time. And also not all the targets here are numerical, they are qualitative as well. So to develop an ambitious road plan, for example. And this is also publicly available, which is just best practice really for accountability, and that's it shows a lot of leadership in doing that and enabling others to follow their suit really. So this is a good example from Lewis Depot. The next slide is more about actions. So an action plan by its nature needs to have some actions attributed to it. So what you want to do with these actions is set out what you are planning to do and also what you're planning not to do. So here you can define environmental actions that are linked to your targets. For example, setting up an energy monitoring system, doing staff training, things like that, really changing your energy provider. So real practical actions that you can take, which are associated with those targets that you set out. It's important to consider that the impacts you need to look at are the ones that you have the most control and influence over. So this is just a very simple framework on the right of the screen there, for you to start mapping some of the things which you might be able to control, influence, or campaign for. And what we mean by those is things that you can control are things that you can directly change. So you can directly change things like your energy provider, your pension funds, your light bulbs. These are things that you can directly control. Things that you can influence are obviously things that you can't directly change, but you can help encourage and help foster. So a good example with that might be something about business travel and how your employees commute to work. You might be able to have a business travel policy, for example. That might be something that you can do to influence and encourage behavior to reduce impacts, but it's not something you can directly control. And then finally, things that you can't control are things that you might actually be able to campaign for. So obviously with environmental impacts, it's a huge systemic challenge that we face within society, and it speaks to wider infrastructural challenges that we face. But there are things that you can get involved with, organizations that you can join, charities that you can support, which and advocacy that you can make as well, political advocacy, which speaks to this wider point about campaigning for change, which is beyond your direct remit, really. And you can justify any areas of environmental impacts that you're currently excluding from your action plan. And this may very justifiably be because you don't have sufficient understanding of the impact area yet, or you don't have sufficient influence to do something about it, or even that you don't have sufficient resource and capacity and funding to be able to do something about it yet. But having that level of transparency is definitely best practice. And just to note as well that when we think of action plans and environmental actions, very often the mind jumps to things about reducing emissions and minimizing negative impacts. Of course, that's important, but we can also focus on actions which have more of a positive impact. So it might be things like support for climate justice charities, or it might be programming on environmental themes. So when you're thinking about your action plans, also think about the positive impacts that you can commit to, which is a slight reframing of how we often think of environmental action. So it's not just about reducing impacts. And a good example of this on the next slide is Watershed Bristol. So I've just picked out this. Again, this is all publicly available on the Watershed's website. But I picked out this particular area of their action plan because I thought it was interesting that there was a specific focus here on projects and programming. So they've got things in here about programming exciting events and films around climate action and climate justice across our public programme, working as part of Bristol Climate Leaders to energise collaboration across the city. And this is all forming part of their action plan. So it's not just about reducing emissions from the organisation. It's not just about the carbon footprint of the building, but it's thinking beyond that to having that wider influence and that wider impact, which I think is really powerful. The next section for the action plan is to consider who is going to be leading it, who's going to be taking it forward. And here are just some very straightforward bullet points. It's just to identify the people who are best placed to deliver, involve them in setting those targets and those actions from the very beginning, not just kind of setting them top down and then expecting people to deliver, to bringing people along on the journey, getting their input, providing any necessary training, and to set up a way of reviewing progress as we go. But the key point really is that responsibility for sustainability should be shared. It's no one person's responsibility. It's not the responsibility solely of the sustainability manager, if you have one, or the facilities manager. It's something that should go throughout the organization to ensure that actions are embedded right across the diverse spread of the organization. And it should enable and empower each individual department to take action. And a step to really making sure that that happens is to formalize sustainability actions within people's job roles. No matter how small they may be, everyone can play a part, and every department lead or anyone who's got a specific responsibility within the organization for a certain function will inevitably have sustainability actions that they can take. So don't just name one person responsible for everything. Maybe this is an obvious point, but make sure it's spread across the organization, because that's the way in which we're going to have the maximum impact and spread the responsibilities. And I'll just end, just because I want to leave some time for a Q&A. Just as a very quick summary again of what an action plan can look like. These do differ. You may have just noticed that the Watershed Action Plan, the publicly available one, is just kind of a list of commitments, but you can internally have something that's a lot more detailed with an objective, a specific target related to that objective. That can be quantitative or qualitative, as I set out. What actions you're going to be taking and the timeline of responsibilities. It's just to give you another example of what an action plan can look like. And then I'm going to return to Watershed, actually, just because I really liked this when I read through, and it's a good point to end on, is that creating an action plan and creating environmental policy is a moving feast. It's not something that you create once and then that's it, set in stone. It really needs to be something, a live document that you return to. And that's mainly because the impacts that you consider will change as the climate changes, and the impacts that you might be having may not be apparent now, and there'll be other things that you need to focus on as well. So what I liked about what Watershed have done with their climate action plan is that they concentrated on laying the groundwork first by focusing on embedding climate action across the organization, developing the resources and the tools that's needed to ensure that action is across all levels of the organization. And then in developing the action plan, it's been refined over time with the priority areas based on results of the footprint data, of measurement, of review processes to understand how action was being implemented. And now Watershed has a number of qualitative commitments around key areas, around the building, around procurement, around the organization, and the programming and project, as I just highlighted on the previous slide as well. So this is a really important point to make, that it is a live document and you should review it as you measure data, as new staff join, everything that Watershed have set out here, really. So I'm going to end it there. And for the final 10 minutes, I think we're going to respond to any questions that you might have. And I'll pass back over to Amy.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, feel free to pop any questions that you have in the Q&A function, or if you want to perhaps share in the chat any of your experiences in developing your own policies and even action plans, perhaps, as we have still a few minutes available.
Thanks very much, Amy and Richard. That's really, really informative. My reflections from that, while we wait for some questions to come through, are that, I mean, the BFI is doing its own work on developing team action plans at this stage and some more top-level strategy documents. We launched environmental sustainability as part of our strategy, our 10-year strategy, in September last year, and it came into effect in April this year. So we're still relatively early on that journey in terms of really specific actions that we can put into a plan. One of the things that we've tried to bear in mind with this webinar particularly is the range of organisations that Julie's Bicycle support. Julie's Bicycle are responsible for 15 different national lottery funds, and beyond production ranges really from anything once a film is released all the way through to archiving and screen archives and the whole screen life cycle. It's a lot. It's an awful lot. So we haven't been overly specific about what you should and shouldn't put in an environmental action plan or a policy, because it really is organizational dependent. It depends on the work you're doing, and it depends on what is suitable for you as an organization to be able to achieve. But we are here to support you. We will have some examples. In the new year, Julie's Bicycle are launching a resource hub specifically for the screen industries. And as part of that, we will have some more detail on examples and where best practice is. But organizations like Depot Lewis, Natasha, I think you're on the call earlier, and Home in Manchester, if you're looking at cinemas and exhibition, are particularly good. But we'll gather some examples from across a range of different organizational types, so that if you are, for example, a screen archive, we'll have really good examples of screen archive sustainability action plans. But bear in mind that some of this is stuff that you can do immediately. Some of this is stuff that you can do over time, and some of this stuff at the moment, so massive decarbonisation projects, for example, are really beyond the reach of most organizations on this call, because we simply don't have government policies and structures and funding plans in place to be able to support you to do that. That's the sort of stuff that I'm working on outside of this. So really interested to talk to anyone who wants to talk to me further about that. In the meantime, we've got some questions coming through in the chat and also on the Q&A function.
Yeah, I think there's one question for you here in terms of the BFI funded projects.
Let's have a quick look. Where? Let me find it.
And the Q&A.
in the Q&A. Is evidence of environmental policy commitment currently embedded in reporting for BFI funded projects? Aha. So when you apply for BFI National Lottery funding, you have to answer a section about what you will do as part of your funded activity to deliver against the strategic principle of environmental sustainability alongside our other two principles. One is EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the other is UK wide. And you have to answer a question on each of those three. And then if you are awarded funding on a quarterly basis, you have to report to the BFI what you've done. Now, if an organization already has a really sophisticated environmental policy, there's no point in us saying to you, you need to develop a policy. So we've left it deliberately quite open for applicants and awardees to tell us what they think is most meaningful. And part of the guidance that we're releasing a new set of guidance for audience project funds, which gives you a steer on how you might answer that question really meaningfully. And then you have access to support from Julie's Bicycle and the resource hub that's coming over in the new year. And we will also have additional resources being developed and released in the next 2.5 years of this partnership with Julie's Bicycle. So the reporting, there is a requirement for you to tell us what you've been doing, but what that is will be based on what you suggested you might do in the first place and any updates to that. We don't specifically say you need to have an environmental action plan or policy, but it is a good start and it is one of our suggestions for award for applicants. If you haven't got one, that might be the first step for you.
Thank you, Keir. Just looking through comments and questions are coming through. So Anna asks, how would you recommend implementing action plans in organizations with minimal budget volunteer team members? I mean, there's definitely, lack of resources that could be for sure, an obstacle into implementing meaningful action. But I think in terms of the process that we've outlined is not necessarily any different, because in doing that exercise of understanding, what it is that you do, who are you doing it with, and what are you able to kind of control and influence, then that's where it's going to come out, that you have maybe that minimal budget and volunteer, and that's kind of how that's constraining your ability to act. And from there, it might arise, well, these are the areas where I can focus given my minimal budget or volunteer team members, whereas these other areas are something for me to focus later on when I'm able to maybe have a bigger team of volunteers or able to gather more resources. So I think like the exercise is still the same, but obviously, as I said, this is all very specific to your organization in terms of what you do and the teams that you have and the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I'd also just, oh, go on, Kia.
Go on, you shout, Richard.
Well, I was just going to echo that really, that just by relating to my last point, that this is a moving picture, that it's something that you build over time. It's not necessarily that you need to do everything all at once. And if you can create those action plans with those clear timeframes, and you can maybe start small, start with the low-hanging fruit, which is still impactful, things like changing your bank and changing your where your pension goes, changing your energy provider. You don't need a big team to do that. You can do that yourself at almost a click of a button, really. And then start to look at those long-term pieces and how you might be able to fund it in the longer term. So don't feel the need, because again, we get to that point about it being too overwhelming to try and do everything at once. Sorry, Kia.
No, I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right, Ami. The process isn't necessarily any different, but what is achievable is what's really important here. And actually having a co-curated action plan with your volunteers, with whatever individuals might have an interest in this area or have some capacity, because it's about everyone making everyday decisions. That's when people co-develop these plans, the implementation is so much easier. If I just wrote a plan for the BFI and sent it around and said everyone needs to do this, almost none of it would happen. So most of my work at the moment is talking to teams and saying, what do you think is achievable? How can I push you as a sustainability person into doing something slightly more than you might have done otherwise, or inspire you to do something slightly more? And then you take ownership of that. The volunteers can take ownership. all the staff across your organization can take ownership if they feel like it's something that they are really inspired by. And so the implementation is really about ownership and dispersed responsibility rather than it being in a single person. My role in the BFI is very much just nudging people to think about their own work rather than telling people what they have to do. I'm aware of time, but there's a really interesting question from Jesse, so I'm just going to flag that. Jesse says, what do you see as the biggest movers for the shift across the film industry? And then we talk about film festivals in this example. The real problem with the BFI's work, the challenge with the BFI's work, is the film industry means lots of different things to lots of different people. If we're talking about production specifically, then that's a challenge for BAFTA Albert, and there are a whole host of wonderful things happening in production at the moment. I was at the Albert Production Summit a few weeks ago. I know there are people on this call who were there as well, and there are amazing things happening there. Beyond production, in terms of live events and festivals, there are all sorts of things happening in other areas. So Richard, for example, is a music person, mostly with Julie's Bicycle, and there are lessons we can learn from music festivals, from live events production, resources that Julie's Bicycle have that aren't specifically film festival, but are very, very similar to film festivals. When we look at cinemas, there's a whole amount of guidance for theatres, and frankly, from an audience perspective, all the way through to you watching something in a theatre is pretty much the same as a cinema. The thing that's different is what goes on behind the screen. So we can learn from the theatre sector. In terms of requirements, we know that, for example, film festivals are thinking about that, thinking about production and production requirements. We're having really interesting conversations with BAFTA at the moment about what they might like to do. And we use London Film Festival, which is run by the BFI, also has the same host venue, the Royal Festival Hall, as the BAFTA Film and Television Awards. So we're talking jointly with Royal Festival Hall, South Bank Centre, BAFTA event team and the London Film Festival team about how can we jointly agree what the steps are that we need to make for similar formats of events. So it's building unusual alliances and looking at what joint actions we can take that are more powerful than the BFI just unilaterally making these decisions. It's all about joint working. It's all about unusual alliances in sustainability. And at the moment, we're at a very exciting time where things may be shifting very quickly in the next 12 to 18 months in a number of areas across the screen industries. There's a huge amount of work going on, and it's really rewarding to be able to be involved in that and see what's happening.
Thank you, Keir. Yeah, we hope to also kind of be putting together what is happening in the sector as we go along through the next couple of years. But yeah, I think something that we've mentioned throughout the session is definitely communicate what it is that you're doing. So also to kind of show the sector what is happening. We're running, we're over time officially already. So we might bring the session to an end. Just to quickly answer to Greg's answer on good examples and methods to discover travel information from audiences. This is something that we will cover in the next webinar. So we will be launching registration and information soon in the next couple of weeks about that. So yeah, make sure to sign up to the next webinar to look into data more meaningfully. And yeah, just to give a thanks to Keir, Richard, Lucas as well in the back end. And thank you all of you for joining us today. We appreciate any feedback that you can give us when we finish the session and the survey will appear. And yeah, we'll share the slides and the recording soon and hope to see you in the next section. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.